The phrase Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, has long stood as one of the most recognizable shorthand expressions for traditional German gender ideology, a triad that seemed to encapsulate the expected limits of a woman's world. Although the expression itself predates the 20th century, its cultural resonance reached unprecedented heights during the era of National Socialism, when it was transformed from a social convention into a political doctrine. Yet the historical reality behind the slogan is far more complex than its simple formulation suggests. The ideal evolved across centuries, shaped by changing political regimes, economic pressures, social movements, and cultural anxieties. It functioned alternately as a prescription, a warning, a nostalgic fantasy, and, in its most dangerous form, a weapon of authoritarian control. To understand the power and persistence of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, one must trace how it emerged from 19th-century bourgeois domestic ideals, how it was challenged and reinterpreted during the Weimar Republic, and how it was ultimately radicalized under the Third Reich into a tool for reshaping society along racial, ideological, and patriarchal lines. This introduction examines the broader historical terrain on which the ideal operated, not as a timeless tradition, but as a malleable and contested concept, one that both reflected and shaped the lives of German women. The phrase Kinder, Küche, Kirche, literally children, kitchen, church, did not emerge suddenly as a political slogan, but was the product of centuries of social, religious, and intellectual developments within German-speaking Europe. Its origins stretch back into early modern social structures, where gendered divisions of labor and moral expectations crystallized into cultural norms. By the 19th century, these expectations had taken on an increasingly institutionalized character, shaped by theological traditions, Enlightenment debates on the nature of womanhood, and the changing social dynamics brought by industrialization. Although the slogan later became closely associated with the German imperial state and ultimately the ideological machinery of the Third Reich, its roots lie in a long and complex genealogy that intertwines domestic ideology, nationalism, and patriarchal models of social order. Historically, the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire offered a patchwork of legal conditions, local customs, and regional attitudes toward women's roles. Nevertheless, a relatively consistent pattern emerges from early modern sources. Women were expected to remain within the private sphere, serving as caregivers, household managers, and guardians of moral order. Protestant reformers played a decisive role in codifying these expectations. Martin Luther, while breaking with Catholic monasticism, simultaneously reinforced the view that women's highest calling was marriage and motherhood. For Luther, the household, not the convent, became the center of female life, and his writings articulated an ideal that placed women firmly under male authority. This theological foundation would later be secularized and transformed into civic ideology by the time the German nation-state came into being. The Enlightenment introduced new theories of reason, progress, and natural rights, yet often reinforced rather than dismantled gender hierarchy. Philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though not German, had significant influence on German intellectual circles, arguing that women were naturally suited for nurturing roles and should be educated only to serve the moral needs of men and the home. German Enlightenment thinkers, among them Immanuel Kant, embraced similarly gendered distinctions between public and private spheres. Kant's writings, while foundational to modern moral philosophy, reflect the prevailing view that women lacked the rational autonomy required for political participation. These ideas filtered into bourgeois culture, shaping expectations of family life, inheritance, and social responsibility. As industrialization began to transform German society in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the family became the symbolic anchor of stability amid rapid economic change. Middle-class anxieties over shifting labor patterns and urbanization contributed to the elevation of domesticity as a marker of respectability. The home was celebrated as a sanctuary from market forces, and women were assigned the role of moral custodians. In this sense, the foundations of Küche, Kirche were as much a reaction to modernity as a continuation of inherited tradition. The emphasis on motherhood and domestic virtue emerged not simply from backwardness, but from a desire to preserve order in the face of industrial and political upheaval. At the same time, nationalist thinkers in the early 19th century began to reinterpret gendered ideals in explicitly political terms. During the Napoleonic Wars, cultural figures such as Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Ernst Moritz Arndt invoked the purity and sacrifice of German mothers as symbols of national regeneration. Women's domestic labor was reimagined as a political resource, essential for the preservation of German cultural identity. The household became an analogy for the nation, orderly, industrious, hierarchical, and morally pure. Thus, by the time of German unification in 1871, the ideological groundwork had been laid for a political culture that regarded women primarily as reproducers of the race and transmitters of cultural values. Religion continued to reinforce the tripartite ideal. Protestant churches in particular emphasized obedience, modesty, and the sacramental duty of motherhood. Catholic regions shared many of these ideals, but framed them through a different theological lens that stressed Marian devotion and the sanctity of family life. Despite confessional differences, however, both traditions promoted a vision of womanhood tied to piety, morality, and service. Kirche was therefore not merely literal, but symbolic. The Church represented spiritual duty, moral discipline, and the acceptance of divinely ordained hierarchy. The 19th century also witnessed the professionalization of domestic science, which transformed household management into a domain of regulated expertise. Manuals, guidebooks, and women's periodicals taught middle-class readers how to maintain healthy homes, rear children responsibly, and embody the virtues of respectable womanhood. These texts often invoked pseudo-scientific arguments about female biology, portraying women as naturally predisposed to nurturing roles. The popularization of such literature helped solidify Küche, Kirche as not merely a cultural expectation, but a normative social model taught explicitly to young women across the empire. Politically, the emerging German state under Otto von Bismarck cemented these ideals through policies that limited women's participation in public life. The legal system codified patriarchal authority in marriage laws, property rights, and civic responsibilities. Women were barred from voting, holding public office, or serving in the military. Their legal identity was largely subsumed under that of their husbands or fathers. Even as educational opportunities expanded, particularly through new girls' schools and teacher training institutes, curricula emphasized domesticity, religion, and moral instruction. The goal was not empowerment, but the cultivation of disciplined wives and mothers who would uphold the social order. Yet despite the conservative thrust of this period, the origins of the Küche, Kirche ideology also reveal tensions and contradictions. Women participated extensively in agricultural labor, cottage industries, and early industrial work, especially among the working classes. The ideal of the domestic woman was most applicable to the bourgeoisie, who had the economic means to maintain separate spheres. For the majority of women, economic necessity outweighed ideological purity, and their lived realities often diverged sharply from prescriptive norms. This gap between ideology and reality would continue to shape German gender politics for decades to come. By the late 19th century, the slogan itself began to appear in political discourse, often used derisively by critics of conservative gender norms. Its power lay in its simplicity. It distilled a complex set of expectations into three memorable words. Though conservatives embraced the ideal, feminists and liberals cited it as evidence of patriarchal oppression. This dual function made the phrase a potent symbol in the cultural battles of the era. The ideological landscape was thus already polarized when the 20th century ushered in new social transformations. The origins of Küche, Kirche, therefore, cannot be understood as a fixed or monolithic tradition. Rather, they represent a dynamic interplay between theology, philosophy, nationalism, social anxiety, scientific discourse, and political ambition. The phrase condensed centuries of cultural expectations into a succinct formula, but its meaning evolved alongside broader societal changes. The establishment of the German Empire in 1871 introduced a new era in which the role of women became intertwined with the ambitions of a modernizing nation-state. Although the Kaiserreich inherited centuries of patriarchal norms, it also confronted the tensions of industrial capitalism, urbanization, and the early stirrings of political reform. As a result, German women's lives during this period cannot be summarized simply through the prescriptive formula of domesticity. Instead, they were shaped by competing narratives, traditional expectations, economic necessity, and nationalist ideology, each exerting pressure on how femininity was imagined, regulated, and lived. In the newly unified empire, political discourse framed the household as the foundation of national strength. The imperial government and conservative thinkers emphasized the importance of stable families, disciplined gender hierarchies, and moral order. This ideological stance reflected broader European concerns about demographic change and social unrest. Women, accordingly, were positioned as guardians of cultural continuity. Their responsibilities extended beyond mere domestic tasks. They were expected to raise children who would embody loyalty, obedience, and patriotic virtue. Legal structures reinforced these expectations. Civil codes, which varied throughout the empire until the national Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch of 1900, placed women under the legal authority of their husbands. Married women had limited control over property and were often excluded from decisions regarding finances and inheritance. Even in regions where traditions allowed slightly more autonomy, the overarching framework of the Kaiserreich promoted the view that women's primary duties were familial. Marriage was not only a social institution, but also a civic expectation. Education reflected these priorities. While the 19th century saw expansions in schooling for girls, curricula focused heavily on religion, needlework, hygiene, and moral instruction. Academic subjects, such as mathematics, history, or natural sciences, were included only insofar as they reinforced the competencies of a respectable future wife and mother. Teacher training institutes for women proliferated, but their emphasis remained loyalty, discipline, and domestic skill. Any encounter with intellectual independence was carefully moderated through the lens of moral propriety. Middle-class culture played a decisive role in solidifying these ideals. Bourgeois families were particularly invested in the doctrine of separate spheres. Men operated in the public world of politics, business, and industry, while women presided over the private world of home and spirituality. The domestic interior came to symbolize not merely a place of residence, but a moral sanctuary insulated from the volatility of public life. Magazines, etiquette manuals, and household guides instructed women in maintaining orderly homes, exemplary children, and faithful marriages. Yet the lived experiences of women in the Kaiserreich were far more diverse than these prescriptive texts imply.
Working-class women often engaged in factory labor, agricultural work, or domestic service. In rapidly industrializing regions such as the Ruhr Valley, women contributed significantly to family income through long hours in textile mills or coal-related industries. Their participation was driven by necessity rather than ideological alignment. Economic reliance on female labor existed in tension with the state's insistence on domesticity. Moreover, urbanization changed how women navigated public spaces. Cities offered anonymity, employment opportunities, and exposure to new cultural forms. While conservative commentators warned that urban life threatened traditional morals, women increasingly used these spaces to pursue limited forms of independence through wage labor, education, or social organizations. These developments did not always challenge patriarchal structures directly, but they complicated the simplistic ideal of the woman at home. Nationalism further shaped conceptions of womanhood. The imperial government frequently invoked maternal imagery in discussions of national destiny. Women were framed as the biological and spiritual reproducers of the Volk. Their bodies became symbolic territory, vehicles for population growth, sites of moral instruction, and metaphors for the purity of the nation. This rhetoric intensified during periods of colonial expansion, when racialized ideas of motherhood emerged as an extension of German imperial ambition. Colonialism influenced gender ideology in other ways as well. German colonies in Africa and the Pacific were imagined as realms where masculine conquest met feminine nurturing. Propagandists portrayed German women as carriers of civilization who would stabilize frontier societies through domestic discipline. Although relatively few women migrated to the colonies, those who did were expected to reproduce the social order of the homeland. The colonial household became a microcosm of imperial hierarchy. Catholic and Protestant traditions continued to shape regional differences. In Protestant northern Germany, teachings emphasized discipline, marriage, and sober domestic responsibility. In Catholic southern regions, Marian imagery reinforced ideals of purity, motherhood, and sacrifice. Despite doctrinal distinctions, both confessions promoted women's subordination within family structures and discouraged political participation. The political sphere remained almost entirely closed to women. They were barred from membership in political parties until 1908, reflecting widespread fears that political activism would corrupt their supposed moral purity. Nevertheless, women found indirect avenues for influence. Middle-class women joined charitable organizations, church groups, and social welfare networks that addressed poverty, education, and public health. These associations served as training grounds for organizational leadership and proto-political activity, even as they remained framed as extensions of domestic responsibilities. By the late 19th century, the women's movement in Germany began to gain momentum. Reformers such as Helene Lange and Louise Otto Peters argued for expanded education, economic rights, and legal reforms. They challenged the rigid constraints of the Kaiserreich while working strategically within its boundaries. The movement remained fragmented between bourgeois feminists seeking gradual reform and working-class activists aligned with socialist parties. Despite internal divisions, women's advocacy gradually shifted public discourse and created new possibilities for participation.
The collapse of the German Empire in 1918 and the birth of the Weimar Republic marked one of the most dramatic social reorientations in German history. The political turmoil, economic instability, and cultural experimentation that characterized the period reshaped established gender norms in ways that alarmed conservatives and energized reformers.
For women, the Weimar era brought unprecedented legal rights, most notably suffrage, alongside new cultural freedoms, employment opportunities, and public visibility. Yet these advances were not universally embraced. Many Germans viewed the rapid changes as disorienting and destabilizing, setting the stage for intense ideological battles over the meaning of femininity, morality, and national identity. This chapter explores the tension between modernization and backlash, examining how the iconic Küche, Kirche ideal was challenged, renegotiated, and defended during the interwar years. At the heart of the Weimar transformation was the 1918 to 1919 revolution, which dismantled the Kaiserreich's patriarchal structures and opened space for sweeping reforms. One of the earliest acts of the new government was granting women the right to vote and stand for office. The 1919 Weimar Constitution enshrined gender equality in principle, stating that men and women had the same civil rights and obligations. This legal shift marked a decisive break from the rigid paternal authority encoded in the old civil codes. For the first time, women were recognized as full political citizens. Approximately 90% of eligible women voted in the first Weimar elections, demonstrating their eagerness to participate in the democratic process. Politically, women became active in multiple parties. The Social Democrats, the Center Party, and the liberal groups all included women in parliamentary roles. Female representatives advocated for reforms in welfare, education, labor rights, and family law. Yet their influence remained limited by entrenched patriarchal attitudes. Male lawmakers often dismissed women's contributions as secondary, and the political culture of the Reichstag remained overwhelmingly male-dominated. Nevertheless, the presence of women in electoral politics was a symbolic challenge to the foundations of Küche, Kirche, signaling that womanhood was no longer confined to the private sphere. Culturally, the Weimar Republic produced the Neue Frau, or New Woman, a figure that came to embody modernity's promises and anxieties. The New Woman was urban, fashionable, sexually liberated, and economically independent. She worked in offices, attended cinemas, rode bicycles, smoked cigarettes, and embraced new forms of leisure. Magazines, advertising, and films popularized her image, presenting a vision of femininity unbound by the constraints of traditional domesticity. The New Woman became an icon of both aspiration and controversy, applauded by feminists as a symbol of emancipation and condemned by conservatives as a symptom of moral decline. However, the New Woman was more of a cultural construct than a universal reality. While middle-class and urban women could access new consumer lifestyles, many working-class women continued to struggle with low wages, long hours, and precarious employment. Rural women remained closer to traditional roles, performing agricultural labor and household duties with limited exposure to modern cultural trends. Economic instability, hyperinflation, unemployment, and wage disparities further restricted many women's ability to live the modern life portrayed in magazines. Thus, although the New Woman dominated cultural imagination, her lived experience remained uneven and often unattainable. Feminist movements during the Weimar years gained new visibility and organizational strength. Women's associations expanded their networks, advocating reforms in reproductive rights, education, and workplace protections. Some groups campaigned for sexual reform, access to contraception, and greater autonomy over marriage and divorce. Others focused on improving social welfare systems, including support for single mothers and child health care. The proliferation of feminist activism reflected the pluralism of the period. Bourgeois feminists pursued incremental reforms, socialist women sought systemic change, and radical activists challenged conventional gender norms altogether. Sexual politics became a central battleground. The Weimar Republic saw groundbreaking discussions on sexuality, reproductive health, and personal freedom. Doctors such as Magnus Hirschfeld promoted research in sexology and advocated for LGBTQ+ rights, challenging traditional moral frameworks. Contraception and birth control information circulated more widely, despite legal restrictions. Marriage counseling centers opened in major cities, offering advice on relationships, contraception, and childcare. These developments provoked fierce backlash from conservative groups who viewed them as assaults on family stability and Christian morality. Another significant challenge to traditional gender ideology came from the expansion of women's employment. Office work in particular grew rapidly as businesses modernized and bureaucracies expanded. Women entered clerical positions as typists, secretaries, and administrative assistants. The image of the young office girl became another symbol of modernity, signifying both opportunity and cultural unease. Critics argued that women's participation in the labor force threatened male employment and undermined family cohesion. Newspapers published articles warning that working women would neglect their children, weaken the home, and destabilize society. The tension between employment and domestic expectations became more pronounced as economic crises intensified. During the Great Depression, male laborers and political leaders frequently demanded that women withdraw from the workforce to make room for unemployed men. Some municipalities enacted marriage bars, forcing women to resign from their jobs upon marriage. These policies reflected a reassertion of the Küche, Kirche ideal as a supposed remedy to social instability. Even in a period celebrated for modernity, traditional gender norms retained significant political and cultural power. Domesticity itself underwent redefinition during the Weimar years. While traditionalists emphasized the sanctity of motherhood and home, reformers sought to modernize domestic work through household science, educational programs, and technological innovations. New appliances such as electric irons, vacuum cleaners, and gas stoves promised to reduce the burden of household labor. Magazines introduced scientific approaches to cooking, childcare, and hygiene, reframing domesticity as a skilled and modern occupation. This reframing allowed some women to find dignity in traditional roles while still participating in the broader modernization of society. Yet it also revealed contradictions, as emphasizing domestic expertise reinforced the very roles many reformers sought to transcend. Religious institutions played a major role in defending traditional gender values. Both Protestant and Catholic leaders denounced the perceived moral laxity of the era, condemning divorce, contraception, and women's public visibility. They promoted ideals of modesty, sacrifice, and maternal duty, arguing that the stability of the nation rested on the integrity of the family. They framed the new woman as a threat to spiritual and national well-being. This rhetoric resonated particularly in rural and conservative regions, where modern culture was seen as an unwelcome intrusion. Political extremism exploited these anxieties. Right-wing nationalist groups portrayed the Weimar Republic as decadent, weak, and feminized. They argued that democracy itself was responsible for the breakdown of traditional family structures and gender roles.
The rise of National Socialism in 1933 marked one of the most aggressive and deliberate re-engineerings of gender ideology in modern history. The Nazi regime sought not merely to reinforce traditional expectations of womanhood, but to codify and weaponize them in service of a totalitarian racial state. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, became more than a cultural ideal. It became a political mandate, woven into policies, propaganda campaigns, labor directives, and educational reforms. Chapter 4 examines how the regime manufactured a new, yet fundamentally reactionary model of the German woman, portraying her as a biological instrument
of the Volksgemeinschaft, a vessel of racial purity and a devoted caretaker of the national family. To understand the Nazi transformation of gender norms, one must analyze not only the ideological rhetoric, but also the bureaucratic machinery, coercive incentives, and cultural narratives that enforced it. The Nazi leadership embraced a deeply racialized worldview in which biological reproduction was central to national destiny. Women were assigned the primary responsibility for increasing the Aryan population, and motherhood became a civic duty. The ideology was articulated in numerous speeches by Adolf Hitler, who declared repeatedly that women's true mission was to be beautiful and bring children into the world. This proclamation was not symbolic, it became the guiding principle for wide-ranging policies aimed at shaping women's lives. The regime envisioned a society where femininity was defined by fertility, obedience, and sacrifice, in direct opposition to the modern independence that had begun to emerge during the Weimar Republic. Propaganda played a crucial role in constructing this gender ideal. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, saturated German society with images of serene mothers, wholesome peasant families, and cheerful blonde children. Posters, films, radio broadcasts, and magazine illustrations promoted the image of the Aryan mother as the embodiment of national strength. Publications such as Frauenwart, the official Nazi women's magazine, celebrated domestic labor as patriotic service. Household chores, child-rearing, cooking, and sewing were framed not as private tasks, but as contributions to the war for racial survival. Even fashion was politicized. Simple dresses, braided hairstyles, and natural appearances signaled maternal virtue and ideological loyalty. The regime restructured organizations for women to ensure ideological conformity. Independent women's associations were dissolved or forcibly integrated into the National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft, which became the primary vehicle for indoctrinating women. Its programs included training in domestic skills, childcare, and racial ideology, teaching women how to maintain healthy households and raise children according to Nazi principles. The League's leaders portrayed their mission as elevating the dignity of motherhood, but their activities functioned as state surveillance and political education. Through study sessions, home visits, and community events, they monitored adherence to domestic norms and reinforced the social pressure to conform. One of the most notorious programs aimed at regulating women's reproductive roles was the Lebensborn Initiative, established by Heinrich Himmler and the SS. Although often misunderstood, Lebensborn was not primarily a breeding farm. Rather, it was a welfare organization that provided financial support, medical care, and secrecy for racially valuable mothers and their children. It encouraged births outside of wedlock if the father was an SS member or otherwise deemed racially suitable. Women were praised for fulfilling their biological mission, and the stigma surrounding illegitimacy was selectively lifted when births aligned with racial ideology. Lebensborn thus exemplified the regime's willingness to override traditional morality in favor of racial goals. Alongside incentives, the Nazi state implemented punitive measures to restrict women's access to autonomy. The regime severely limited women's educational and professional opportunities, rolling back the advancements made during the Weimar years. Universities imposed quotas that drastically reduced the number of female students. Women were pushed out of professional fields such as law, medicine, and academia under the pretext that intellectual work damaged their reproductive capacity and distracted from their domestic duties. Policies like the law for the reduction of unemployment offered marriage loans that could be partially forgiven for each child born, effectively bribing women to leave the workforce. These loans were tied to resigning from employment, reinforcing the separation between public and private spheres. The labor demands of the early Nazi economy complicated the regime's anti-work ideology. As Germany rearmed and industrialized, labor shortages emerged. While the state continued to discourage women's full-time employment, especially married women's employment, it made pragmatic exceptions when necessary. Women worked in agriculture, domestic service, and certain industries, particularly in the early years before full wartime mobilization. The contradiction between ideological prescriptions and economic necessities reflected the inherent instability of the regime's gender policies. Nazi propaganda attempted to reconcile this tension by portraying women's labor as temporary or supplementary, emphasizing that their true vocation remained domestic. Education became another battleground for shaping gender roles. Girls' schooling focused heavily on physical health, racial hygiene, homemaking, and moral obedience. Biology courses were infused with eugenic content, teaching racial classification and the principles of hereditary purity. Athletic training emphasized physical fitness for childbirth rather than competitive sports. The Hitler Youth's girls' division, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, indoctrinated young women through camping trips, physical drills, community work, and instruction in Nazi ideology. These activities cultivated loyalty to the state while preparing girls for their future roles as mothers and wives. Religion, traditionally a central component of Küche, Kirche, occupied an uneasy position in the Nazi gender model. While the regime appropriated certain Christian themes, sacrifice, duty, and family, it sought to subordinate religious institutions to state control. Church influence over marriage, schooling, and social welfare was gradually eroded. The Kirche component of the ideal was thus reinterpreted to align with Nazi racial mysticism rather than conventional Christianity. Women were encouraged to view their role as not spiritual guardians, but as biological agents of the Volksgemeinschaft. The regime's hostility towards independent religious authority explains its selective suppression of church organizations that challenged Nazi gender ideology. The idealized image of the Nazi woman, devoted mother, loyal wife, and contented guardian of hearth and home, stood in stark contrast to the complicated, often harsh realities faced by millions of women in the Third Reich. Although propaganda prescribed a life centered on Küche, Kirche, wartime demands, labor shortages, economic pressures, and the expansive ambitions of the Nazi state pushed women into roles that contradicted official ideology. This chapter explores the gap between propaganda and reality by examining women's labor, social experiences, wartime mobilization, and the profound contradictions embedded within Nazi gender policies. From the earliest years of the regime, many women found themselves navigating a difficult balance between ideological expectations and material necessity. While the state applauded early marriage and large families, economic realities for working-class women, especially in industrial regions, made complete withdrawal from the labor force unrealistic. Textile factories, agricultural estates, domestic service, and administrative offices continued to rely heavily on female labor. In rural areas, farm work remained physically demanding and essential to sustaining Germany's food supply. These women received little recognition from the regime, which celebrated domesticity but depended on the agricultural workforce to support its autarkic economic agenda. Industrial expansion in the mid-1930s further intensified reliance on female labor. As the regime embarked on massive rearmament projects, the demand for male workers skyrocketed, and women increasingly filled positions in light manufacturing, clerical work, and service industries. Although the Nazi Party publicly condemned the double burden placed on working mothers, it did little to provide systemic childcare support, leaving many women to rely on extended family networks or older children to manage domestic responsibilities. The absence of state-provided services revealed the contradictions inherent in praising motherhood while necessitating women's wage labor. The regime's labor policies reflected these tensions. Official directives encouraged married women to exit the workforce, offering marriage loans and tax incentives to promote domesticity. Yet by the late 1930s, labor shortages led to subtle reversals. Restrictions on women's employment were gradually relaxed, and industries were quietly encouraged to hire female workers. Employers often framed women's employment as temporary or supplementary, even when they relied heavily on their labor. This ideological inconsistency underscored the gap between rhetoric and economic necessity, a gap that widened dramatically with the onset of war. World War II transformed women's roles in ways that the regime neither anticipated nor ideologically prepared for. As millions of men were conscripted into the military, women became indispensable to the wartime economy. They took on an array of roles: factory workers, tram conductors, office clerks, nurses, agricultural laborers, and auxiliary staff for the military and administrative tasks. Despite the Nazi leadership's reluctance to mobilize women fully, wartime realities forced the regime to acknowledge their contributions, though always through the lens of patriotic sacrifice rather than empowerment. The labor demands of total war paralleled transformations in women's social positions. The myth of the idyllic Nazi household deteriorated as bombings destroyed homes, families were separated, and shortages in food and basic goods intensified. Women managed rationing, navigated long queues for supplies, and improvised to sustain households amidst scarcity. Their domestic labor became a form of wartime endurance, but it was rarely acknowledged in the regime's glorifying portrayal of motherhood. Instead, propaganda focused on the symbolic role of women as mothers of soldiers, framing their suffering as noble and purposeful. One of the most striking contradictions between ideology and reality emerged in the regime's treatment of women in auxiliary military roles. The National Socialist ideal excluded women from combat, emphasizing that warfare was the realm of men. Yet, as the conflict intensified, women were recruited into auxiliary services such as the Luftwaffe's communications units, anti-aircraft crews, and administrative offices for the Wehrmacht. While they did not serve in frontline combat, these roles placed them within the military apparatus, contradicting earlier claims that women's involvement in war should be strictly domestic. Propaganda attempted to reconcile this tension by depicting auxiliary workers as maternal supporters of the fighting men. Yet the tasks they performed often required technical skill, discipline, and at times exposure to direct danger. Nursing provided another domain where ideology collided with lived experience. The regime portrayed nurses as icons of feminine virtue, selflessness, and purity. Uniformed women of the German Red Cross featured prominently in propaganda, symbolizing compassion and national service. Yet the reality of nursing during the war was far more complex. Nurses confronted overcrowded hospitals, traumatic injuries, infectious diseases, and the emotional weight of tending to soldiers facing devastating psychological and physical wounds. Some nursing units were implicated in the euthanasia programs that targeted disabled children and adults, revealing the darker ethical terrain that professional women navigated under the regime. In occupied territories, German women encountered another set of contradictions. Female administrators, secretaries, nurses, and teachers deployed across Europe found themselves functioning within systems of racial oppression, forced labor, and violence. Although women were rarely policymakers, many participated in the daily functioning of occupation regimes. Their roles ranged from bureaucratic tasks that supported confiscation of property to participation in welfare programs reserved for settlers of German blood. The regime portrayed these women as civilizing influences, bringers of order, and embodiments of racial superiority. Yet their presence also reveals how deeply gender ideology intersected with the broader goals of conquest and racial hierarchy. The experience of motherhood during the war diverged dramatically from the celebrated ideal. While propaganda extolled large families, wartime hardship made child-rearing increasingly difficult. Malnutrition, displacement, psychological stress, and the absence of fathers strained households. Evacuations of children to the countryside as part of the Kinderlandverschickung program separated families for extended periods. For many mothers, the promise of safety of the program was overshadowed by anxiety and dislocation. Childcare responsibilities multiplied, even as women were pressured to contribute to wartime labor. The psychological toll of raising children under bombardment starkly contrasted with the serene visions of family life promoted by Nazi imagery. The harshest consequences of wartime gender contradictions emerged during the final years of the war. As the front lines approached Germany and the Allied bombings intensified, women became the primary managers of survival. They dug trenches, repaired homes, organized community shelters, and cared for wounded or displaced civilians. The breakdown of infrastructure forced women into roles that were far removed from domesticity, including emergency logistics, local administration, and ad hoc leadership in communities where male authority had collapsed. The state increasingly relied on women to maintain order, even as official ideology insisted that their proper place was at home.
The collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 did not erase the cultural memory or lingering influence of Kirche. Instead, the ideology underwent a transformation shaped by post-war reconstruction, political division, generational shifts, and evolving social norms. Chapter 6 explores how the ideal survived, mutated, and was reinterpreted in Germany and beyond, leaving a complex legacy in modern debates about gender, identity, and remembrance. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Germany was a landscape of devastation, physically, politically, and morally. Women played an essential role in rebuilding homes, communities, and social structures. The Trümmerfrauen, or Rubble women, became emblematic of this period, symbolizing resilience and labor rather than domestic seclusion. Their visibility challenged the Nazi-era ideal, demonstrating women's capacity for public leadership and physical endurance. Yet the cultural admiration for their wartime labor did not translate into a lasting redefinition of gender roles. As soon as stability returned, social pressure pushed women back into domestic responsibilities, reflecting both lingering patriarchal norms and a longing for pre-war normality. The division of Germany into East and West created two divergent trajectories for the memory of Kirche. In West Germany, FRG, conservative political forces and the influence of the Christian churches helped revive traditional family structures during the 1950s. The economic boom of the Wirtschaftswunder reinforced the male breadwinner model, and many women were encouraged to leave the workforce when they married. The wartime chaos had shown that women could work in factories, run businesses, and manage civil society. Yet the post-war ideology once again celebrated female domesticity. Kirche re-emerged as a cultural norm, even as formal policy avoided explicit references to the Nazi past. Domesticity was framed not as racial duty, but as social stability and moral renewal. East Germany, in contrast, pursued an entirely different path. The socialist government rejected Kirche as a relic of bourgeois and fascist oppression. Women were mobilized into the workforce, childcare was socialized, and gender equality was proclaimed as part of the socialist project. Yet even in the GDR, official ideology did not entirely break with traditional expectations. Women faced the double burden of full-time employment and household labor, and leadership positions remained male-dominated. Nevertheless, the East's policies generated a distinct legacy in which women's economic independence became normalized, contrasting sharply with the FRG's post-war retreat into domestic norms. Memory of Nazi-era gender ideology became a contentious issue during the decades that followed. For many women who lived through the Third Reich,
Speaking about their experiences was fraught with difficulty. The glorification of motherhood under Nazism, along with the regime's crimes, created a silence around the topic of women's participation. Female auxiliaries, secretaries, nurses, and administrators who had worked within Nazi institutions found their roles minimized or morally condemned, even when their participation had been coerced or shaped by limited choices. Public discourse tended to portray women as victims rather than agents, a narrative that both protected and constrained them. During the late 1960s and 1970s, feminist movements in West Germany began to challenge the lingering ideal of Kirche. Activists critiqued domestic confinement, patriarchal structures, and the cultural memory that continued to shape expectations for women. They argued that post-war society had failed to confront how Nazi ideology exploited and manipulated gender roles. Feminist scholarship uncovered the extent of women's involvement in the regime's bureaucratic and social systems, highlighting both complicity and coercion. This research complicated earlier narratives of victimhood and demanded a more nuanced understanding of women's experiences under Nazism. Meanwhile, cultural representations, films, novels, documentaries, and exhibitions began to explore themes of memory, guilt, and generational transmission. Depictions of Nazi motherhood, female indoctrination, and women's wartime labor shifted from simplistic portrayals to more complex psychological and historical analyses. These cultural works helped reshape public understanding of the era, although they often grappled with the discomfort of revealing how deeply gender ideology had penetrated everyday life. The legacy of Kirche extended beyond Germany. Throughout Europe, the image of the German woman as an emblem of domesticity and obedience became part of broader discussions about fascism, gender, and political extremism. Scholars examining authoritarian regimes noted recurring patterns: glorification of motherhood, control of reproduction, restriction of women's public roles, and elevation of traditional family structures as foundations of political order. The Nazi example became a cautionary symbol of how gender norms could be weaponized in service of extremist ideology. In contemporary Germany, debates about motherhood, labor, reproductive rights, and gender equality still carry echoes of this past. Policies such as parental leave, childcare subsidies, and workplace equality laws have evolved significantly, yet public discourse often revisits the tension between domesticity and professional life. Some conservative groups invoke nostalgic images of family life that indirectly resonate with older ideals, while feminist movements continue to highlight the historical dangers of rigid gender norms. The Nazi manipulation of Kirche serves as both historical warning and cultural memory, shaping awareness of how seemingly benign ideals can be politicized. One of the most significant transformations in the legacy of the ideal is the recognition of its racialized dimensions. Modern scholarship emphasizes that the Nazi vision of domesticity was inseparable from its genocidal project. The ideal German mother was not simply a housewife; she was a biological instrument of racial ideology. This understanding reshaped historical interpretations, connecting gender policy to broader systems of violence, eugenics, and exclusion. The afterlife of the ideal thus becomes a lesson in the intersection of gender and racial politics. Education and public memory institutions, museums, memorials, archives now routinely address the role of women in the Third Reich, both as victims and as participants. This marks a crucial shift from earlier decades when women's experiences were marginalized in historical narratives. Exhibits on wartime nursing, female labor, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, and women in concentration camps offer multidimensional perspectives on gender under Nazism. These efforts contribute to a deeper, more honest engagement with the legacy